One. All right. We are live on Facebook for another Brandon's briefing. We're going to give everyone a moment to join us. Before we get started, we are honored to have two very special guests today to talk to us about uh, the role of social work in the time of COVID-19, Bobby Holmes and Katie Evans. So we're going to give everyone a moment to join us before we get started. So thank you to everyone who's going to join us again on our live, but also just again, always hoping that everyone is healthy and safe. So we're going to give you a few more seconds to join us, and then we're going to go right into it. We see folks are coming in on Facebook. Please come in, sit down, get your dinner, and listen to some folks who are going to talk about the importance of social work during COVID-19, which we know is going to be a very deep and important conversation. So thank you to everyone for coming. We're going to get started in just 30 seconds. 30 seconds, everybody, and we will be live on Brandon's briefing for today, May the 6th of 2020. All right, 10-second countdown. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another briefing with Brandon, where we've been discussing what you need to know about COVID-19 and everything going on in the city of Baltimore during this crisis. If this is your first time tuning in, I, of course, am Council President Brandon Scott, and today is Wednesday, May the 6th, which ironically is the 1 year anniversary of me becoming Council President. So it's been a great year serving the citizens of Baltimore as your council president, and thank you for having me. Before we get started with our very special guest, I want to remind everyone about and let everyone know about the latest data as far as COVID-19 in the state of Maryland and across the city of Baltimore. Statewide, we've had 28,163 cases of COVID-19, totaling 1,338 deaths across the state of Maryland. Here in Baltimore City, we've had 2,752 cases with 131 confirmed deaths. 21215 is still the zip code in the city with the most cases with 427, and 21218 is the zip code with the second highest in 205. Remember, you can go to coronavirus.baltimorecity.gov or coronavirus.maryland.gov for the latest stats and information. We want to always make sure that we're informing you about that. So that we continuously take this virus very seriously, everybody. And that's why we're always inviting different guests on here to talk about different angles to this COVID-19 crisis. So today, and now I'm going to bring in our guests. We're inviting into the conversation Bobby Holmes and Katie Evans, who are going to talk about the importance of social work during COVID-19. First, I want to thank you both for your service to the citizens of Baltimore. And just before we get into questions with you guys, can you, starting with Katie, just give a brief background on yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me tonight, Council President. My name is Katie Evans. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the outreach coordinator at Spark Center for Women. We're located down in the Pigtown neighborhood, but our scope is Pigtown sort of over through Mount Clair and Carrollton Ridge and down through South Baltimore and neighborhoods like Brooklyn and Curtis Bay. So primarily we're a harm reduction drop-in center. So our goal is just to meet people where they're at and provide whatever service they're looking for that day, be it watching Netflix on the couch and eating a snack, or getting syringe services, or meeting with a nurse, or talking to a lawyer, case manager, etc. We're one of many harm reduction drop-in centers in the city, or one of a handful. And then prior to that, I spent about a year as a mental health clinician working in the intersection of mental health and homelessness and substance abuse. So that's sort of the world that I fall in. And I am a proud graduate of the University of Maryland School of Social Work and a member of the National Association of Social Workers, who I wanted to mention are very thankful to you for recognizing social work this evening as a frontline profession in the COVID crisis.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Katie. And thank you for all that you do. Bobby, please introduce, or for you, reintroduce yourself to everyone, because I don't think there are many people in Baltimore City who don't know Bobby Holmes.
Oh, first, I just want to say thank you, Council President Scott, for inviting Katie and I on for this important discussion about the role of social work during this time of the pandemic, and how are we supporting folks we serve every day, how our work has changed. I am a social worker, child welfare social worker here in Baltimore City. I also do therapy for park and psychiatric services here in Baltimore City as well. I am the founder of Son of a Dream, which is a multimedia venture that uses media to explore issues impacting youth and families. I am also co-founder of Reflection of Kings, a youth media program that serves Black boys in Baltimore.
Thank you, Bobby. And as always, thanking you for everything that you do, and especially like what you've done for the youth in Baltimore City. And Bobby, I'm going to start with you for questions. What are the front-facing issues that you're seeing with Baltimore's youth during this health pandemic?
Well, a lot of challenges. Let me first start with what's happening in child welfare. As everyone knows, that's we talk about our most vulnerable populations here in Baltimore, where you have children and youth that may are susceptible to child abuse and neglect, and then they come into care with agencies that offer support with the children and youth. So the dynamics of our work have changed in child welfare, needless to say, where as we navigate and do our work, we have to take safety precautions for ourselves, particularly those in child welfare, child protective services, as well as those who are doing monthly visits. Is it becomes paramount for us to protect ourselves as well as figure out how do we get services to our youth. One issue that I've had experienced thus far is the digital divide, which thank you, Council President, for your work on that, addressing the issues with lack of laptops in Baltimore City. So many of our youth do not have access to these valuable resources. It was very interesting when the stay in place order came down and the other restrictions came down for COVID-19, where we had to close schools. And one thing that Baltimore and many other cities across the nation, but Baltimore had to figure out not only how are we going to continue learning for our youth, but how are we going to connect our youth to food, healthy foods, have meals for our children. So these are the type of things that I've been dealing with as a social worker working in child welfare, trying to get the resources for the children and youth I serve every day, trying to make sure that they have laptops so they can continue on with learning until the close of the school year, and making sure that they have food, making sure that they have masks. So our work has changed and it's gotten a little challenging, but I'm definitely more happy to say my colleagues have definitely stepped up to the plate and delivered for our children and families that are involved in child welfare. As far as my other side, working with youth and families with therapy, teletherapy is now being offered to a lot of children and youth who are already experiencing some tough circumstances, whether we're talking about trauma, whether they're dealing with depression or anxiety. COVID-19 outbreak has only heightened these challenges for our youth and families as they now have to figure out how do I cope with being inside, not allowed to have that much needed connection that we all need with families and friends and being out in my community and being forced to shelter in place and now being forced to learn online. So it's a lot of different dynamics that our children and our youth in Baltimore have to face under this pandemic, and it's been challenging. It's been challenging with the youth I work with, hearing what they have to say and what they are experiencing, and it's rough to say the least.
Thank you, Bobby. And I think that one something we always talk about on these briefings is how this pandemic is exposing even further inequities that already existed in Baltimore. I want to our audience that's watching live on Facebook, we can see that there's a lot of folks watching. Want to tell everyone to send your questions in now. You know we will get to them. We want to make sure that we're hearing from these great, wonderful experts, these leaders who are working on the ground as social workers on the front line. These are another group of heroes that we have to uplift into the conversation. So, Katie, I want to talk to you for a question for you here. Can you speak to the struggles faced by those who are dealing with SUVs and housing insecurity during this crisis?
Absolutely. So COVID has changed our entire service delivery model. Like I mentioned previously, we were a drop-in center, and I know when information was first coming out about coronavirus, our thoughts as social workers were like, so what? We deal with bed bugs every day, and people have SARS and MRSA and open wounds, and they're coming in. How big of a deal is this really? And I don't think the reality really hit us until we realized it was unsafe to operate a drop-in space. And then trying to deal with the imbalance of having places for people to go that are safe during the day. That's something that we emphasize at Spark a lot, is that we are a place where people feel safe and comfortable. And without that, where do people go? And there's so many centers like ours who have had to close for the same reason. So even just access to showers, access to laundry, access to food, new clothing has been severely impaired. And then you add the restrictions and the guidance for COVID, which is a whole nother level. For example, some of the folks that we see on outreach live in the woods. So how do you ask them to wash their hands or to stay in the same area? And there's harm reduction is the nature of harm reduction is to meet people's needs and meet people where they are, which I think has put us in a good position to adapt. But at the same time, some of those issues are structural, like you're mentioning, and we're just seeing the divide on a greater level because we don't have any other places to send folks. For example, if somebody has an intravenous drug use wound, we would suggest that they wash it on a regular basis. They can't do that, can't wash their hands. So similar to Bobby, we've been distributing food and masks and hygiene supplies, hand sanitizer, water. One of our goals is to sort of mitigate the risk of other diseases during this time, because we don't want people going to the ER for a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness go to the ER for everything because they don't have primary care. But now that's not an option either, because we don't want folks to go to the ER unless they absolutely have to reduce the risk. So both that housing insecurity piece and then just that underlying demand of working with folks who are using drugs and trying to keep them well and healthy is particularly hard when you can't access folks directly and they can't access other services.
Further distance from contact with their kids due to not cohabitating with their kids during this pandemic. Can you talk about how that is even having a deeper impact?
Sure. So there's a lot of ways that people have been distanced, just everybody, but it's particularly hard if you're a mom who no longer has access to her kids for different reasons. A lot of the folks that we see are in different transitional periods, and we know that recovery is not like just a thing that happens, it's a lifelong process. So during that process, a lot of times people are separated from their kids or separated from family members that are key to them. And generally, if you weren't shut down, you'd be able to hop on a bus and go to the foster care home or go to the family member's home where your kids are. And now those are things that we don't recommend. And we know that it's been really challenging for people's mental health, especially when they have those extra barriers in their family structure. That's the same for also folks who have family members who are incarcerated who can no longer go visit them.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. We know that we have this opioid crisis in Baltimore. Everyone knows that I will always talk about how Baltimore is suffering from. We were suffering from two public health crises, where you consider gun violence and COVID, but you can throw a third one on that, and that's actually the opioid crisis. Bobby, how have you seen this affect young Black boys in Baltimore, and how has that changed amidst COVID-19?
Well, there's a lot of layers to this in terms of how different communities are impacted by this crisis, right? We cannot ignore the elephant in the room, which is inequities within our city, as we've known that existed, and as we work to address it, this COVID-19 pandemic as another labor. So when we're talking about the culture in Baltimore, when we're talking about how do we go about our day-to-day lives, and folks communing within neighborhoods, and trying to understand and educate folks on the importance of social distancing. But it's tough in some ways. So being mindful that these folks are going about life as they know it. And I, I've been a little bit a little bit taken aback by folks' response to some of the boys, squeegee boys, etc., that are going about their day to day on the corns, etc. Yes, it's something that no one wants, of course, but I think our approach, we have to be very clear on how do we connect to our youth, how do we engage our youth and educate them about this pandemic and ways they can protect themselves. I definitely saw folks like John Comer from the Architects of Justice giving out masks, Baltimore Ceasefire promoting safety precaution, giving out masks as well. So Baltimore, the city that we all love, coming together as it always does, particularly during a crisis, and supporting one another, community members supporting one another, particularly to our young folks. I think about Corey Witherspoon from Seeds of Promise, who gave out lunches to the boys that he worked with. My partner Ross Trey and I engage in our boys on a consistent basis with our programming. So understanding that we cannot demonize our youth, right? We don't agree with folks being outside. We want to encourage and respect social distancing, but we also want to be careful not to demonize and criminalize our youth. What I name is several examples of folks who have taken initiative in our city to engage our youth, which Brandon, that's something that you're well aware of. You've been doing for quite some time, and just emphasizing the importance of engaging our youth and educating our youth, and also having a conversation with our youth, because we forget that they are vulnerable as well, and they are susceptible to this virus as well. So having that much needed conversations with them about how they feeling, how their mental health, and that's something that we often miss when we think about the corner boy, or we think about the other group of boys that's in our neighborhoods. We tend to forget their well-being and their state of mind. So definitely, I love what I'm seeing already within our city, of so many people, so many community leaders reaching out to our youth and engaging our youth on different levels.
Yeah, and Bobby, I think that, listen, I actually spent a good part of my after the border estimates this morning. I was over in East Baltimore, pushing a cart, actually looking like Bubbles from The Wire, pushing a cart around down Lanville Street in Lafayette in East Baltimore, helping to give out not just food, but also masks to families and young people, because we know that's what's needed. We know that with the trauma that Baltimore continuously has gone through before COVID and now during it, that's the best part of Baltimore, as you know, coming together, people coming together, going and interacting with people that they normally don't interact with. And I think that we all have to uplift that and show how we can continue that. And Katie, I wanted to give you the chance to talk about that as well, but also talk about how harm reduction practices have adapted during COVID-19.
Absolutely. Similar to what Bobby was describing, the harm reduction community has shown a lot of similar efforts for connection and supporting each other as services change in delivery and time and schedule throughout the city. I know other organizations similar to ours, like Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition, Charm City Care Connection, Yes Youth Drop-In Center, are all working to try and meet people's needs in other ways. So both the existing needs that we were serving before, and then some of these growing needs caused by the void in services. So for example, coordinating syringe services among community-based providers, coordinating and distribution through community-based providers, like really trying to dig into the grassroots and the organizations that are already there and have been there serving folks. to try and distribute things for overdose prevention, like we were speaking about before, to prevent that. We know that with coronavirus, it can labor people's breathing, and an overdose is a lack of oxygen. It's when the oxygen's cut off to the brain. So we're aware that people are at a higher risk, that people also might be taking more high risk behaviors because there's sort of this mindset of like, oh, well, like I have a hierarchy of needs. I need housing, I need food, I need all of these things that I need to survive. I don't have the mental space to also think about extra precautions for COVID. So we're trying to give people the resources and tools to be able to do that. Speaking more broadly about harm reduction, I'm a big fan of your support of overdose prevention sites. That's something that is really important to us, to give people access to different types of substance abuse care. Harm reduction, for those of you who don't know, is, I've said this a few times already, but it's really meeting people where they're at. So if somebody's ready to keep using and wants to do that in a safe way, we want to give them the tools to keep using in a safe way. If somebody is engaging in sex work, we want to give them tools to do that in a safe way. If somebody is, like, there's just so many different high risk behaviors that you can mitigate the risk level with different other behaviors, just like wearing a mask during coronavirus. That's very similar to giving somebody a syringe for drug use. So harm reduction is sort of built to address public health needs. And I think that we've been able to do that, like I described, by working with other organizations and trying to use our existing outreach platforms and grow those. At Spark specifically, we've been using Google Voice and other means to get in touch with people and provide contact supply deliveries and things like that. But we've also partnered with other organizations to do some foot outreach. So we're trying to balance our own employee health risk with also keeping folks engaged in services while we're unable to host a space for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as you highlighted, Katie, that I've done some work advocating for overdose prevention sites and other harm reduction approaches in Baltimore because listen, we've been dealing with this overdose epidemic my whole life. And the way that Baltimore has been dealing with it, much like the rest of the country, has been wrong. We've been criminalizing people who are essentially suffering from something that should be a public health issue, not a law enforcement issue. So just you gave your opinion. I think that's the future of where we're going to go in Baltimore. You know, I'm going to push that legislation now. Just want everyone to know that when you grow as an individual, I always talk about my understanding of harm reduction and changing my mindset on it as a part of my growth as a human being and as a man. You, as a leader, is also I have to then show you, the citizens of Baltimore, how we can grow better together to impact people's lives because we cannot continue to have our brothers, our sons, our mothers, our fathers die to overdose in Baltimore when we know there are places around the world that are putting things in place to keep those people alive so that when they're ready, we can get them the help they need. I want you to talk to you guys. I got two more things for you before I let you go and we go to some questions. Couple things, conflict and communication. We know that people are staying home. Our young people are staying home from school now for the rest of the school year, and maybe, as we don't know yet, maybe in the beginning of next year. And we know that sometimes everyone being together all day, all night can lead to some conflict. Do you have any advice for adults about how to communicate with the young people in a better way and vice versa? And talk about, you guys, I guess, make it a little personal. How are you dealing with it? Like for you, Bobby, how are you dealing with it at home with your daughters, and how are you managing? And what advice do you have to other people?
Uh, um, Being patient and understanding is how I've been. From as a father, as a husband, my wife and I um, have been having frequent talks with our youngest daughter, who's 9 years old, and she's dealing with being away from our friends. We've keeping her engaged in programs, room works, church programs, via Zoom, so she can have that connection as much as possible. But it's still difficult. As you know, the order for all schools across the state to be closed down, came was announced today, and she took it hard. She's been, like a lot of kids throughout the state, been away from their friends, been away from their day to day. So, just parents having those frequent check-ins, something as simple as that is so important. Having frequent check-ins, how you doing, how you feeling. stopping everything, taking that time out of the day to dedicate that time to have those tough conversations with our children. So those check-ins are important. We're going through it, and just like we go through it as adults, as parents, our children are going through it as well. So making check-in a priority throughout the day, throughout the week is very important, and parents being mindful of the many resources that are out there for you to gain support. There are so many agencies that are still offering therapy through teletherapy now. So when things get a little bit too much, being mindful to reach out to various resources that are out there. National Association of Black Social Workers, Baltimore Legacy Chapter, has launched a website, Baltimore blackcommunityresources.com, blackcommunityresources.com, where folks can go and see the resources that are in Baltimore and across the state where they can receive the support. So I encourage folks to visit that website, but definitely doing check-ins and checking on the well-being of your child and other folks within our community. Yes, definitely.
Thank you. And Katie, I don't know if you want to chime in there, but also want you guys to talk about uh, grief and trauma. We know Baltimore again is no stranger to either or, but COVID-19 has been devastating for families in Baltimore because of physical and social distancing. People can't gather to grieve in the ways that they normally would. How are you seeing the community deal with grief now? And in your professional opinions, like what kind of advice can we give to people as we're dealing with such deep grief and trauma in Baltimore, but now having an extra layer of not allowing us to do that in the way that we're accustomed to?
Yeah, I can think this from personal experience and from checking in with other social workers. I know engaging in social work through practices like telepsych can be draining and cause burnout and all those other things that are not uncommon to the social work world, but I think can maybe sneak up on us a little bit faster now that we're home all the time and don't really have that sort of like pattern or routine. So I know something our team has been checking in with each other a lot, and it's very helpful because somebody's mental health can really deteriorate a lot in just the course of a day or a couple days. And so it's always important to have that mindfulness and that check-in just to give somebody else space to be heard. And I think that tends to be my strategy just in general. Whenever there's something larger than myself or larger than my home that I can't control but want to contribute, is to do just that, to support the community and work with folks where they need the most support. And I think that it can be easy to feel like in a time of crisis, like, oh, I need to shut down, I need to hunker down, I need to reserve resources for myself and my family. But it feels a lot better, and it feels more like a holistic approach to also take time to consider what you can do for your neighbors and those around you. And sometimes those smallest things, like sending somebody a check, like a text to make sure they're okay, or driving by and waving, can mean more than we give them credit for. In terms of the grief and the trauma in the community, we've had fewer personal interactions with people in the last month just because we can't get close to them. So I have less of a finger on the pulse of what people are experiencing, but I can say that the rate of overdose death is not slowing down from what we can tell, and people are definitely dealing with the trauma and the grief depending on how that situation goes. So that is something that we're still hearing a lot about. The resilience of the people of the city is remarkable, and I think that's still showing up every day, if not shining brighter during this time. That's something that's always, even as a native Baltimore person, that's always been striking to me, is how resilient, unfortunately, but resilient nonetheless, people are in the city and making it yet another hurdle.
Bobby, you want to chime in on that?
Sure. Well, you already said it, Council President. Just looking at, and you mentioned it before, in the media, just violence doesn't stop. Unfortunately, it continues within our city. So folks are still dealing with that. Folks are still dealing with losing loved ones, and just being mindful that grief and loss, it's not just goes beyond death. but it also extends to our attachments and our relationships that we have. So being within isolation of not having that family member that you want to speak with and touch and hold and connect with, but you can't right now. So that is and also an extension of grief and loss. Children in child welfare, um, the children in foster care right now who are not able to have visits with their parents. That again, that attachment, that relationship, has been disrupted right now because they could not have their visits due to the closures and restrictions with COVID-19. So they're being affected as well by not seeing their mom or their dad on a consistent basis. So grief and loss all the way around, and in its many forms is showing up right now, and is even more difficult when you go to funeral homes and you want to mourn, you want to grieve with family members, as my family recently experienced when we lost a friend of the family. But there's a limitation on how many people can be in the funeral home at one time. So folks got to wait in their cars, um, and wait for other people to come out of the funeral home before they could go in and see a loved one. So just the way we grieve and the way we mourn is being affected right now. And again, I give all the praises and shout out to everyday folks, community members. Baltimore Ceasefire is still having a Baltimore Ceasefire virtually to promote peace in Baltimore City. Um, and I'm just grateful for so many folks, so many warriors on the front line that's continuing to uplift. Baltimore showing up in its true fashion as always, and coming together even during this time. So when we talk about grief and loss, again, I cannot stress enough of parents and community members, neighbors reaching out to folks, sharing resources with folks. There are resources out there. There's so many people that are doing so much to address food security, to address mental health, to give masks. So I will stress to folks, reach out to the many resources that are out there, the websites that are out there, and connect with folks.
The other thing I'll mention in terms of resources is I know we've talked about child abuse a few times, or just child neglect, things of that nature. We know that there's likely more child abuse going on that's not being recognized.
Not being reported, absolutely.
Yeah, and on the state website, the MDH website, you can find a full list of different symptoms, like emotional symptoms and things like that, that you might not automatically recognize. But if anybody's watching who's taking care of kids that aren't their own or interacting with kids that are in a different household, it could be a good thing to take a good look at, since we know other people aren't on it as much as they were able to be before.
Yeah, thank you for that, Katie. And I think that that's important. It's also important about intimate partner violence right now and child abuse violence. And listen, to anyone that's watching this live, know that you're not alone. I think we can work with you. Send us a direct message. We'll try to get you the help you need. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, so that we can make sure that you are getting served the right way. Because no one should have to live through anything like that. Also, I just want to point out that Bobby brought up some good stuff there in his last remark too. Think about it in a little personal for me. So, Bobby, as you know, Katie, you may know too. Most of my family lives in the 21215 zip code, right? So, where my parents live, where my grandparents live, where my aunts, my uncles, my cousin, all live there in the neighborhood in Park Heights where I grew up. And with that, for me, it being the heavily most impacted and preventing me from going to see my grandma, and actually having a friend of the family, Bobby, actually die, that was very close with my aunt the other day, and us not being able to do what we normally do, right? For me, it's even causing me to think about these things and take some time, because I couldn't go over to my aunt's house, which is literally the house that I grew up in, because of this. And when you can't go into places that you have a key to get into, it changes the way that you see the world. And I think that everyone has to understand, as these great social workers have told us, that understand that it's okay to be dealing with this trauma and grief, and understand that the world is different, and that you can get help in some sort of way. We have to do that. And the last thing I want to do, you guys, because I see that we have a couple, just a few viewers questions. And someone pointed out this question, and then I want to allow you guys to ask me a couple of questions before we depart. But someone brought up what is most needed: money, food, other things, and where to send it to support these groups. Listen, there are always great opportunities for us. If you send us a direct message, we will connect you to one of each, or even if you want one encompassing organization, we will always also give you the connections to the organizations that our great guests mentioned tonight as well. But we always know that we want to keep people informed consistently. So I want to thank, before we even let them ask me questions, I want to thank our guests for their wonderful, wonderful words tonight. And then Katie, Bobby, want to see if you guys have any questions for me before we close out.
Again, Council President, thank you for facilitating this conversation, leading this conversation. Extremely important as we try to connect with folks and just inform them about the resources that are out there. Letting folks know that the support is definitely out there to please reach out to the support as needed. And the question that I would say comes to mind that's at the forefront of my mind, Council President, is again, it's going back to this issue of inequity within our city. I find it very eerie, lack of better words, that 5 years later, after the uprising, one crisis that shed light on our inequities as a city, we're back at this conversation again 5 years later. And I've known that you have pushed to address equity within the council, and as well as right now with addressing the digital divide. Um, but I would like to know, do you have any thoughts on, particularly as we look towards next year in the legislative sessions? Do you have any thoughts on any plans or ideas on how we can address inequity within our city as well as our state on a larger level? Because we're back. It feel like we're back at square one again 5 years later, and I think it's time to address inequities within Baltimore.
Yeah, thank you, Byron. It's a great question. And listen, I say each and every day that COVID-19 just exposed even to more people the deep inequity that existed in Baltimore. I think that Bobby, as you and I, we were together literally doing unrest out there on the streets of Baltimore, and we were having similar conversations then. That it wasn't a big shock to us because we've lived here our whole life and we knew that. And actually, from that unrest. Came a very powerful piece of legislation that I passed now 2 years ago, which actually now is going to take full throttle beginning with this budget that the mayor just presented today. And that's the equity assessment program. You, Bobby, you know that Baltimore is the birthplace of housing redlining via legislation, right? We have the street, until I get it renamed, Preston Street, named after the person who actually did that. They took that legislation, took it around the country, right? The only way to undo inequity, structural inequity that was done via policy is via policy. It's not good enough to have a black person running an agency, a woman or a gay person, if those policies were written 30, 40, 50 years ago. So what's going to happen now is that the agencies have begun to start to do the training and those things like that. But what will happen now moving forward, Bobby, is every single thing that they do, their capital budget, which has been the most egregious place where inequity has existed in Baltimore City, has to be presented through a lens of racial, gender, and economic equity. The operational budget that was presented today, right? The first thing that I said to the individuals that, well, you're going to have to show me when you come to the council how this was done through a lens of equity so that we can start doing the tough work of building better systems and also changing the way we invest our public dollars to go back and start to build those neighborhoods that were purposely disinvested in the first place. So as I always say, when I'm dead and gone, that's what people remember me for. But that kind of change takes time, right? I couldn't just go straight to those city agencies and say, do this now. Well, first they had to be taught on what equity is. They got to start doing training. They need to hire an equity coordinator to build that up. In the state, we also, I think we need the same piece of legislation at the state level And I'm not going to divulge that, but there are several individuals who I've talked to who are very interested in that, so that we're going to see this work as we go over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years and see a direct change in Baltimore. It's a great question. Katie?
My question is more specific about services during coronavirus. I know that there have been concerns presented by other organizations about people who are incarcerated, people who are living in shelters, frankly, the slowness in which it seems to be addressed on a city level, even with things that seem like they could be more accessible, like hand washing stations and public restrooms and things like that, but then also further sort of the conversations about unused housing, and then the Mayor's Office of Homelessness Services and its current state of turmoil. I was just curious if there's any sort of plan to get through that and to address people's needs.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. It's a very great question and a very important point. I actually, April the 7th, I released my COVID-19 document that folks can find at baltimorecity.com and click COVID-19. And in that, I specifically talk about using our rainy day fund to do things like rapidly rehouse homeless people, right, in Baltimore City. We also know the work and advocacy that we've done to try to get, which we've done some, Governor Hogan to release, nonviolent criminals and people, seniors, so that we can have them come back home and stop the spread of COVID-19 throughout the system as well. We know, and I'm going to continue to press, this is one of the frustrations of being a legislator, especially during a time like this, is that legislation takes time, right? Like, for example, today, I introduced last week a piece of legislation that will now, when we pass it, and the mayor signs it, will prohibit landlords from raising rent during COVID-19, something that most people would think would be common sense, but we know common sense sometimes isn't very common, right? We're going to continue to press to make sure that everything that's in my power as city council president, I'm going to try to legislate that we do that and do it as quickly as possible. But where I can't do that, or it makes better sense, we will do other things like write letters to the mayor, as we've done, to say, hey, we need to do things like send change the way we do streets so that people have more access to physical distancing, right? Also, resolutions are the way that we go. Remember that I led the way to say, hey, we need to require masks in the city of Baltimore, facial coverings. All of that kind of work will continue for us, because COVID-19 for me is something that is very serious, and I'm going to do everything in my power to help everybody in Baltimore, but with an intentional eye on the most vulnerable people in our city.
I appreciate you looking at it with a lens of support instead of a lens of further policing or something of that nature, because really it is about tapping into rainy day funds and making sure people's needs are being met. So I appreciate your advocacy.
Cool. Bobby, any more before we go?
Just keep your foot on the pedal, sir. Keep your foot on the pedal.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Bobby. Holmes, please give your lovely wife and daughters my love as always. Katie, thank you for joining us. Please keep up your great work. We appreciate very much the great work around harm reduction, and know that it does not go missed by me, and that you have a partner in the fight to bring harm reduction to the forefront in Baltimore City. So thank you both for joining us this evening. Thank you for your great work. Please stay healthy, stay safe, keep your families healthy and safe, and make sure that in addition to taking care of everyone else, I need you to take care of yourselves as well.
Thank you, Council President.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you both.